My name is Benebo. Farming for food is usually performed on subsistence farms, and the occupation more often referred to as subsistence farming. Synopsizing, I present for considerations the subsistence farms and the applied practices, the limitations on productivity, and revisions to the practices, and the potential wider adoption of subsistence farming in the modern age. The green designing of the modern age subsistence farm is also included for the consideration of the would-be farmer, effectively eliciting the prospects of high productivity beyond normal expectations. A subsistence farm is a landmass being used for farming food items for the consumption of a household or a community. These type of farms were pervasive in many parts of the world before the advent of agricultural technologies that enabled the plowing and tilling of land, expanses of land that opened up the industrial farms or large-scale farming. However, this type of farm is still in use in many underdeveloped countries, such as Africa and South African countries, and also in households in the developed countries where some individuals have extra land and like to plant some vegetables for themselves, and generally where the landowners may not have the money to buy the agricultural machines or technologies to plow large expanses of land. Even if they have large expanses of land, they would rather just use a small portion of it, not having the money to buy the technologies. However, some landowners, even in developed countries, and still perform such farming as a means of supplementing purchases from groceries. The typical subsistence farm is primarily a type of farm which people use to produce food for the family. Such farms are usually small to moderate in size that can be worked by one family. Often the land size is from small to moderate. These farms suffer several known problems, some of them stemming from the level of knowledge of the farmers and limitations in operations inevitably introduced by the farmers through their chosen mode of operating the farms. The type of farming has several issues that limit the productivity that is realizable from such farms. These farms seldom have the need for the use of fertilizers. The most prominent of the reasons for this situation is that these farms are often small, so without economy of scale. The quantity of resources, say fertilizers, that may need to be purchased for use is not of such volume as to enjoy volume purchase discounts, and as a consequence, the hands working the farms are seldom interested in purchasing fertilizers for use to increase productivity. However, even when the farms are of moderate sizes, because of the owners of most such firms, even in the developed world, are often poor by classification, they do not have the funds to invest in the purchase and use of fertilizers to enrich the quality of the soil as to increase productivity. Interestingly, even the not so poor subsistence farmers suffer a dearth of knowledge, when in fact a high level of knowledge requirement is necessary to decide on the use of fertilizers, and so precludes their capacity to make informed decisions. These collectively result in the lack of use of fertilizers with very little return for their hard work input. Prepping of farms for farming entails removal of dead trees and bush parts, when in fact the dead plants and parts should be recycled into the soil to enrich the fertility of the soil. The failure on the part of most subsistence farmers to recycle the biotics into the soil often stems from limited understanding of the interrelationship between the nutrients captured in the biotics and the extractions of the nutrients. Consequently, rapid depletion of the fertility of the soil obtains. The fact is, these people have traditionally been low-level chemical knowledge. Hence, they do not always appreciate the fertilizer capacity inherent in those plant wastes that get thrown out yearly. That correspondingly introduces limitations to the soil fertility for food production. Of course, As the gooiness of the soil depletes with the failure to return the nutrients to the soil, the texture of the soil becomes such as to unable to prevent erosion of the soil during rainfall. Again, because of the often small sizes of these farms, mechanized farming is not even considered, as there is not the return on investment in the purchase use of farming machines. As a result, this type of farms are also very labor intensive. Further exacerbating the disinclination to using machines is that the usual practitioners of subsistence farming do not have the funds to buy the farming tools essential for performing the mechanized farming activities. Consequently, the productivity of these farms is directly tied to the number of hands that work the farms. Accordingly, larger families realize higher productivity than smaller families based on working the same farm size. Very often, regional governments also ignore these farms because of their small sizes. Consequently, these farmers seldom enjoy the benefits of having the government send agricultural staff to provide advisory or consultant support on operating a subsistence farm for high productivity, including teaching the chemical knowledge of soil and the advantages of keeping the dead biotics on the farm. Although the subsistence farms, as has been shown, is mostly small to moderate in size as defined by the number of hands working the farm, there exists many situations for which this sort of farms are just the most appropriate to plan for and to implement. The situations suggesting the use of this type of farms, which are presently delineated, makes a rethinking of the farm very appropriate. Given the changes in the circumstances and developments of technology, a rethinking of the subsistence farm is warranted. Although the subsistence farm, as has been shown, is used mostly by the poor and the people of the underdeveloped and developing countries or highly populated land-scarce communities, there exist many situations for which these sort of farms are just the most appropriate to plan for and to implement. The implementation of subsistence farms on small land masses has changed perceptibly compared to the years past. The use of subsistence farms in the present age, however, has both changed and remained the same. Various uses will be survivalist subsistence farm. Survivalists, those people who constantly anticipate some form of apocalypse, always prepare for that day when there will not be the modern day amenities and therefore will be forced to assume tasks of directly producing food for the consumption of the family. Generally take up residences in locales, including in the forest, as to live off-grid and on properties that have small spare lands on which they practice farming in preparation for the doomsday. Such parcels of land, together with the farming practices of the survivalists, effectively form the survivalist subsistence farm. And then there are the developing countries' subsistence farms. Of course, as since time immemorial, the poor and weedy who seek to provide for the family with access to small pieces of land have always resorted to supporting farms on such lands. These parcels of land, though not able to support more structured farming practices, nonetheless enable the feeding of many such families. And many such family farms are both abundant and ubiquitous in the developing and underdeveloped countries all over the world. Then we have the specialty produce subsistence farms, which is annexed. Homeowners in the developed countries who happen to have some land space in their properties also occasionally like to undertake farming specialty produce for the use of the family. Then, of course, the challenge of making ends meet also forces unemployed workers of all stripes to convert spare lands annexed to their properties into subsistence farms as well, in attempts to supplement food item purchases. Then we have the organic holistic subsistence farms. Health-conscious people who also prefer to not eat processed food tend to secure land, albeit small land, for the purposes of farming their own food. Quite often, such people buy farm properties, sell of the bulk of the land, but keep just enough space for themselves to farm their own organic, moderate size, and sometimes produce more than the family's needs. But the extra are usually still just given away to neighbors for their feeding, effectively still allowing these farms to be subsistence farms. And then finally, there is urban subsistence farms. Under certain conditions, several small subsistence farms may be farmed together in coordination of the produce assignments to each farm as to result in coherent collection of produce for balanced meals. Situations in which such farms obtain are in the urban areas where dilapidated buildings or old warehouses and factories are converted into farms. The floor spaces are packed with low height or depth troughs of metal troughs, which are filled with soil such that each trough becomes a small subsistence farm. Besides, an entrepreneurial person converting an unused urban property into a farm, the property owner having difficulty at renting a property may also opt to convert such property into an urban farm. Of course, such conversion of urban property into urban farm requires that the would-be farmer obtain all applicable licenses and permits from the regional governmental authorities of the municipality for undertaking the farming operations. The prospective wider use of this subsistence farm as delineated so far above makes it imperative to consider various solutions to overcoming the limitations as also aforementioned. So, for the more modern implementation of the subsistence farms, a level of modernization would be appropriate to avoid some of the limitations of the traditional subsistence farms and bring about very luxuriant soil that supports higher productivity. Besides being a source of generating food for the family and community, subsistence farms also stands to offer humanity the chance to green living, as many small parcels of open land are available and thereby help tackle the matter of global warming. Of particular consideration under the circumstances of global warming, tailoring the provisioning method to align with and adopt operations that mitigate or at least not augment the contributions to global warming would be commendable. So then, green designing a subsistence farm or subsistence farm in general is commendable. Rationally then, determining and implementing green solutions for addressing the limitations of the traditional subsistence farm is apt, as such thrust addresses two considerations at once, based on resources requirement: soil, water, sunlight, and augmented with fertilizer. Power, security. The task is the determination of the applicable sources of the resources and the provisioning of the resources. Clearly, as written, the order is just right through order consideration, flips the need for power and by fertilizer. As already observed, farms are usually very labor-intensive and hard, exhausting work. However, the entire expense of the hard work aims only to bring about a fertile soil for the planting with the object of gaining relatively higher productivity. Therefore, an essential characteristic of a farm is soil. The quality of the soil is critical to the capacity to produce. Surface or topsoil is essential irrespective of the ground base available to support the farm. Requisite depth of 6 inches of fertile topsoil is necessary and must be got by buying soil or from dump or by the dig-up of the ground base land to 6 inches. Most living matter consists of water, so abundance of water must be available to the subsistence farm. So then the very first task of the farmer is to secure water for the farm. For urban farms, however, this is trivial, as the pipe-borne water system readily brings water to every urban locale and therefore by default to the farm. Of course, the farmer may yet choose to have the water distilled or at least thoroughly filtered before use. However, for non-urban farms, provisioning water as well as the method of provisioning is significant. For farms near a body of water, be it a lake, spring, river, or sea, nature will have provided the means of the farmer. The means the farmer must devise, a means of moving some of the water to the farm. The chosen means, of course, depends on the type of farm. The most convenient is the use of pipe laid to the body of water with pump on the pipeline to pump the water from the resource to the farm and possibly into a water tank for storage, and subsequently let flow from the height of the water tank to the farm area for watering the farms. In the absence of a body of water from which to take some of the water, a borehole offers the best option. But as with the case of the body of water, the farmer must now contend with getting the water out of the borehole and perhaps similarly into a water tank storage. Again, that task is attended to with some form of a pump. But first, a pipe must be pushed down the borehole to the level below the surface of the water. In each of these cases, the pump deployed may be an electrical powered pump or one that is manually operated by the farmer. Air and air circulation is another very important supply of the farm. Of course, air is important as it consists of carbon dioxide and the plant needs carbon. So a good aeration is necessary for the farm so that the produce would grow well. For farms in the open space, there could be better provisioning of air. However, for urban farms, special provisions must be made to cause the air to flow through the spaces where the farms are placed. In some cases, it may be necessary to cut out large holes in the walls and to then place large fans to move air into the interior open spaces for the produce to get good, fresh air. Sunlight is also critical for the farm if it must have high yield productivity. The requirement for the farm is sunlight. Farms in the open spaces with no form of canopy above the landmass, there can be no better construct that assures the receiving of sunlight when the sun is up. For urban farms, however, special designs must be made to ensure that sunlight is radiated on the farm. Of course, there are urban farms in which LED lights are used in the present premise of equivalence with sunlight, but nothing can be further from the truth. The provisioning of light must be sunlight as necessarily opposed to LED light. Sunlight is singular in its characteristics, and no other light has the same characteristics. Reactions, photoreactions driven by sunlight have reaction mechanisms that are distinctly different from the mechanism driven with any other light. The fact is, sunlight is the emission of thermonuclear reactions in the sun, and thermonuclear reactions are a sort of hydrogen bomb reactions, and no light generated here on Earth by man is so generated as actually the light of an earthbound thermonuclear reaction. High productivity in subsistence farms within the context of the essential requirement as delineated is facilitated or enhanced with the availability of abundant plant nutrients in the soil, effectively keeping the soil very fertile. Although naturally fertile soils do have the nutrients in abundance, the soil fertility is ordinarily improved with the application of fertilizers, albeit chemical fertilizers manufactured in chemical processes using raw materials that are fossil fuel based. Infusion of the soil with fertilizers increases the content of plant nutrients in the soil. Fertilizers provisioning requires certain considerations, however. The prevailing form of industrial fertilizers are chemical and to some extent subject to various regulations and hazardous management administrative controls. The fertilizers tend to wash away in rainfall runoff during raining, and this results in environmental pollution in the form of algae blooms in the rivers and seas and even oceans in some cases. Naturally, this imposes social responsibility demands on the farmer, suggesting the use preferably of fertilizers that do not only enrich the soil of the plant nutrients, but also tends to not run off readily. With rainwater, runoffs should be preferred. Effectively, fertilizers of choice are such as would improve the natural humus quality of the soil, as human soils are characterized with high tortuosity, and as such prone to hold the water within and prevent runoff. Choice of fertilizer, therefore, is partly guided by the requirement of enriching the gooiness of the soil as to mitigate the rainwater runoff of the fertilizers, and this excludes fertilizers of chemical origin. Fertilizers of biotic origins, however, tend to enhance the gooiness of the soil. So inferentially, infusion of the soil with fertilizers of biological origin should improve the gooiness of the soil. Even so, the choice of fertilizers is often premised on the need for rapid growth, and so shortened growth cycles. This is achieved with the choice of fertilizers that gets readily assimilated into the metabolism of the plant processes. By the science of the mechanisms of metabolism, all stages of the biosynthesis is accelerated with the provisioning of amino acids in large enough quantities, effectively eliminating any prospects of bottleneck that the anabolic reactions may inadvertently introduce into the process. This understanding suggests the use of biofertilizers produced from microorganisms as such tend to mostly expose the cellular amino acids to the plant roots in the soil, enabling immediate absorption and assimilation. Indeed, the assimilation of the biofertilizers of microorganisms is better, as the fertilizers are already in the amino acids compositions and so easily metabolized with biosynthesis into the target protein, given that the intermediary anabolic reaction steps are some respects short-circuited. So a necessary task that must be performed in course of planning to operate a high productivity subsistence farm is the application of biofertilizers to the farm soil, which amounts to a green designing of the farm, given the explicit exclusion of the use of chemical fertilizers which are fossil fuel based. Obviously, or not so obviously, the application of biofertilizers to the soil, the implementation and operation of the light radiator that radiates the sunlight on the farm space, the water from the water sources delivered to the farms are all easily accomplished with the availability and use of electric power. So the provisioning of power is an essential task. Of course, the power provisioning implementation would entail the utilization of energy sources in the waste of the farm. After all, the improvement of the farm is being made in the context of minimizing contributions to global warming. Remarkably though, the utilization of the farm waste provides yet one more means of recycling the farm waste to the operating of the farm, as opposed to being just carted away into the dumps. Implementation of power for assist and to lighten burden introduce consideration of resident high knowledge. The object need for power as being to lighten the labor intensive of the farming tasks suggests the green technology of the power source be based at mechanics scale level of knowledge. One technology that obviously can be developed and deployed at the requisite do-it-yourself scale level is anaerobic digester technology. Empowered with this technology, a farmer simply introduces the biodegradation of the farm waste into biogas and then burns the biogas to generate heat, which is then captured with a very simplistic heat electricity converter, or in more technical jargon, a thermoelectric transducer, which generates electricity from heat, and hence the power required to more easily perform the task of farming, even at the subsistence farming scale. Naturally, success attracts criminality, and so the farmer would expect the pilfering of the farm produce in the best case scenario of criminality and outright raiding of the farms in the worst case scenario, and so must take appropriate steps to protect the farm. So, if able, the farmer should install security systems on the farm. However, this subject is beyond the skills of an ordinary farmer. In conclusion, subsistence farms augmented with green technologies and the applied practices can suffer very high productivity and therefore significantly impact the prevailing state of world hunger and even alleviate the state of poverty to some extent. Of course, the implementation of green technologies, even if at the do-it-yourself skill level, as will be presented in the subsequent episodes of this podcast, may still require some support from the local government bodies in the form of community service, agriculture, development, consulting agents.